What's up, nerds? You might be wondering what we're talking about today. As if you couldn't tell, we're talking about the fact that I have joined the Panderverse. So, content warning, this is an editorial. It might be triggering, it might seem a little hostile. So if listening to me be a hypocrite and stuff is not something you want to talk about, probably not the best time to stop watching this. Greetings from the Panderverse. I am your Wizards of the Coast shill, the OGGM, coming to you live from Site B at 9:57 in the morning of this, the 10th day of November 2023. The weather outside is fall for California. So what is this? I've decided to take a page from my good friend Grim Jim and address some of the comments that have come across my desk over the past week or so. And you might be vaguely aware that there was a brief dust-up between myself and my friend DM Bloodworth, and another brief dust-up between myself and another individual regarding why I sell out, why I pander to the mainstream, why I give so much attention to Wizards of the Coast, why I give so much attention to Level Up 5e, why I give so much attention to Cobalt Frog Press and Black Flag, why do I give so much attention to the other companies that are making 5th edition product if the whole point of January was to support companies that weren't making 5th edition. How can I say I'm old school if I continue to support the companies that are making 5e product? And how can I say I'm old school if I continue to talk about Wizards of the Coast and what they're doing in 2024 and the shape of Dungeons and Dragons? Now, in order to have this conversation, I have to make a few things clear in the way my brain works. Now, this is exclusive to me. This is the way my autistic dyslexic brain works, okay? 5th edition, the engine is perfectly fine. 5th edition, the engine is not Dungeons and Dragons. 5th edition, the engines and Wizards of the Coast are two separate things. 5th edition, the engine, the mechanics is perfectly fine. The way Wizards of the Coast deals with this property, Dungeons and Dragons, that has been given to them is awful. Now, Hasbro owns D&D. They can put Dungeons and Dragons name on anything, including 5th edition. We could all either agree, yes, 5th edition is Dungeons and Dragons, or if you're like me, you say, no, it's not Dungeons and Dragons. 5th edition is its own thing, but Wizards and Hasbro can put D&D on whatever name they want. They can take this sandwich and say that's Dungeons and Dragons, and you can't do anything about it. Now, the main argument from day one has been Wizards of the Coast, Dungeons and Dragons is not Dungeons and Dragons the way we remember it. That is why so many of us in the old school support these third-party OGL companies like Troll Lord Games or whatever. So when January happened, and in generally it has been, we hate what Wizards of the Coast is doing with D&D. We want somebody who respects Dungeons and Dragons to be in charge of Dungeons and Dragons. And therefore, we also hate 5th edition. And then we come up with a lot of reasons why we hate 5th edition. Now, there are other companies that are making product for 5e, like Kobold Press. Kobold Press has been making product for 5e since pretty much day one. They have received most of the awards for 5e product. They continue to make just amazing stuff. Their take on 5th edition is better than Wizards of the Coast take on 5th edition, and Tales from the Valiant is probably a better take on 5th edition than Wizards of the Coast. So why do I support Kobold Press and Tales from the Valiant and talk about them every week? Because Midgard is considered by many to be a much better setting than Wizards of the Coast 5th edition Forgotten Realms. And the way Kobold Press has handled 5e is considered by many to be a better take on 5e than Wizards of the Coast. So we don't want Wizards of the Coast to have D&D anymore, right? We want other companies to either take D&D away from Wizards of the Coast or make alternatives that will take money away from Wizards of the Coast D&D. We all agree that 5e D&D is not D&D. We all agree that we don't think Wizards of the Coast is handling Dungeons of the Dragons the way we wanted to. And many of us have said We want somebody else to do that. Now, the only way that's going to happen is if attention is taken away from Wizards of the Coast handling of Dungeons and Dragons, not 5e, okay? How they are handling the brand. Again, 5e is a perfectly fine engine. It's not Dungeons and Dragons. It would be a great engine for other games, you know, Spelljammer, Iron Kingdoms. These are all things that the mechanics of the Saturday morning cartoon 5th edition would work for, but it's not Dungeons and Dragons. So here are companies that are doing 5e better than Wizards of the Coast. So obviously I want Kobold Press to make money, to make enough money that Wizards of the Coast goes, wait a sec, we're losing money to these guys. Why? And the fan base goes, Kobold Press is doing 5e better than Wizards. Okay, so this is the 5e. This is the company that understands the way 5e works and what 5e is supposed to be, and they've run with it, as opposed to Wizards, who doesn't understand what 5e is. Same goes for Level Up 5e. Level Up 5e saw what Wizards was doing with 5th edition when Tasha's came out, and they went, oh no, we can do the exact same thing better, have it make more sense, have it be more approachable, and have it be less controversial, which is what they did. And they have been rolling away consistently since Level Up Advanced 5e came out. They are, as I keep saying, my people's champion of the 5e contenders, my Chad Gable. They just do the work, and the work is good. They understand what 5e is supposed to be. They have created a better take on 5e than Wizards of the Coast. They didn't have anything to do with January. And as of today, even though they're not listed in the most anticipated, I would say this is one of the companies that I would want that Wizards of the Coast Dungeons and Dragons money to go to. So why do I pander to these companies? Because I want them to succeed. And if you want Wizards of the Coast to give Dungeons and Dragons away, then you probably want these third-party 5e companies to make better versions of 5th edition than Wizards of the Coast, because we want Dungeons and Dragons to be treated with the respect we feel it deserves, right? Or we want a Wizards of the Coast to sell Dungeons and Dragons to another company because it's not making them money. Well, we want Hasbro. This is all about what Hasbro is going to do with D&D, because face it, Hasbro could shut Wizards of the Coast down tomorrow, and it looks like they're already rethinking the direction, and still make D&D related product for years, as long as they think they're making that balloon of $1 billion a year off the D&D brand. So, but if these other companies start chipping away, start taking that fan base away from Wizards of the Coast, the 5e fan base goes, Level Up 5e is better than 5e is being handled by Wizards of the Coast. I want to play that version of 5e because this is the 5e the way it's supposed to be by a company that understands it. If Kobold Press is doing a better job with Tales from the Valiant and the Project Black Flag SRD, link down below. If you want to use the Project Flag SRD, it is free to use and will allow you to make D&D content, Tales from the Valiant content, Paizo 3rd edition, content, anything that is even vaguely somehow related to D20 or the OGL, you can make content using the Level Up 5e SRD as far as we understand it until Wizards of the Coast tries to take it away. So I want these companies to succeed. I want the fan base to start to go away from Wizards of the Coast and go towards Tales from the Valiant. I want the fan base to go away from Wizards of the Coast and go towards Daggerheart. I want the fan base to go away from Wizards of the Coast and go towards Level Up 5e, because Kobold Press, Level Up 5e understand what 5th edition is supposed to be. Wizards of the Coast doesn't. And I think we all agree the handling of Dungeons and Dragons by Wizards of the Coast has been incorrect, especially this last year. So we want Wizards of the Coast to either go, scenario one, we are losing money to these other companies who are doing 5th edition better than we're doing because we failed to understand what the engine we created works with. 5e is not Dungeons and Dragons. Kobold understands that. Level Up 5e understands that. I don't know if DC 20 or these other 5e contenders do it. And Matt Colville obviously understands it because he's making a completely different beast based upon the best of 4e and the best of 5e. But he can still sort of be considered in this formula, you know, I guess. It depends if he actually puts the 5th edition name on it or not, but that's a separate whatever. All right, so scenario 1, we want people to see, we want Wizards of the Coast to go, wow, we dropped the ball on the Dungeons and Dragons legacy. The old school hates us, and the 5e player base are so sick of our nonsense that they're going over to these other game companies who get them. Because if you've ever actually met a 5e player, they're as angry at Wizards of the Coast as you are, I assure you. And if Wizards of the Coast sees that they're losing money, they will either, Hasbro will go, you're not making us that $1 billion a year we said you had to make by 2027. Remember, even Crawford admitted 5 years, 2027, that sword of Damocles is hanging over their head. Then Hasbro will either go, we're going to sell Dungeons and Dragons, the 5e engine, to somebody else, you know, or we're going to go, okay, it's time to do a new version of Dungeons and Dragons that will get the fan base back because Wizards, you dropped the ball. Remember that Dungeons and Dragons 6X is still on the Hasbro calendar for June 2027. What the fuck that means, we don't know, but it's still there. It is still hanging over Wizards of the Coast, Jeremy Crawford's head. Hasbro just drove a huge Mason-Dixon line, which nobody noticed, because now we have D&D Studios, which is Crawford and, you know, Perkins and all the D&D people, and we have Magic the Gathering. It is as Hasbro said, okay, you are now 2 separate entities. You are now D&D Studios. And you, Wizards of the Coast, is Magic the Gathering. And they're board games? Well, we already know Hasbro took board games someplace else. And all the other Hasbro IPs are being, like Transformers, are being handled by other companies. So it looks to me like Hasbro doesn't have a lot of faith in Wizards. Hey, how'd you fuck up the deck of many things? But still has faith in Magic the Gathering. So Hasbro could, when 2027 rolls around, go, wow, we're losing money to Level Up 5e. We're losing money to Kobold Press. We're losing money to Matt Colville. We're losing money to all these other 5e products. Our stuff isn't getting nominated for awards, but Kobold Press's stuff is. We need to change D&D because you have failed to make us that $1 billion a year, or we need to sell D&D to a company that understands it better than you do. Either way, Wizards of the Coast, we do not like the way you are handling D&D right now. We see where the money's going, we see where the fan base is going, and we accept that we have failed. So either make a 6th edition of Dungeons and Dragons that brings both the old school and all the other people back, or we're going to give D&D to someone else. So that's what I want. And I would think all the people who year after year after year have told me how they hate Wizards of the Coast is handling D&D and they wish Dungeons and Dragons was handled by somebody else who understood it, I would think you would want to support Kobold and Tales from the Valiant. You would want to support Level Up 5e. You would want to support Matt Colville's D, whatever it's going to be. You would want to support the third-party 5e market because that's where you want Wizards of the Coast's money to go. Because if the fan base understands that Level Up 5e is doing a better job with 5th edition than Wizards of the Coast is, if the fan base understands that Kobold Press and Matt Colville are doing a better job with 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons, than Wizards of the Coast is, that is where their money will go. That is who they will get behind. And that is what Hasbro will see and go, Wizards of the Coast, you need to change Dungeons and Dragons to get that fan base back. So that is why I motherfucking pander to Daggerheart every week and say, support me, Daggerheart. I want those millions of critters to drop the ball on 5th edition and take their millions of dollars to Daggerheart. That is why I pander to Kobold Press and Level Up 5e and these other companies every week, because I want the angry 5e players to take their money away from Wizards and take it to these third-party companies. So Wizards again sees we have dropped the ball. We need to change Dungeons and Dragons to get the old school back, to get the 5e players back, to get everything we lost back. How do we fix all the mistakes we made in 2023? And it looks like we're going to continue to make in 2024. Hasbro says, make a new system, June 2027, D&D 6X, or we sell D&D to someone else. Because look what these guys are doing with 5e. They're doing a better job with 5e than Wizards of the Coast is. So that's why I pander. That is why I give the mainstream so much attention. Why am I not giving Adventurer, Conqueror, King attention? Because basic OGL guys, you're fickle. You're fickle. You were all over Kelsey and Shadowdark until you weren't. And then you were all over Greg and Dragon Slayer until you weren't. And you were all over Castles and Crusades until you weren't. And now you're all over Adventurer, Conqueror, King, which has already made, you know, how much money. But how long will you stay loyal to Adventurer, Conqueror, King? Is it going to be the next OGL King of the Hill or not? I don't know. And why am I not supporting it? Because everything Adventurer, Conquering King does, I already have. Because I have all the other OGL old school games I had to get over the last 5-10 years. You know, I've got the Castles and Crusades, and Troll Lord Games has purchased my loyalty by sending me the free copy of Castle Zaggy. So, of course, I support them. And I support Kelsey because she's my friend. And I support Ed from Dragon Song because he's my friend. And I will support other companies in the old school if I think it's worth my time. Or if it's somebody I believe, you know, Basic Experts game that he came out with. I supported that because I respect the guy and I respect the amount of work he did to put into it. Just like Pundit. The amount of work Pundit puts into, I respect that. So, you know, that's why I support Pundit stuff, because the amount of work, the amount of research, the amount of, you know, stuff he does. I'm not going to support Adventurer, Conqueror, King because I already have everything it's offering me. So, and what happens when you guys decide to take your loyalty to a different game? Hey, remember all the people who said they were going to run Castles and Crusades and invite me to Castles and Crusades games, and we were going to play Castles and Crusades, and I had to buy Castles and Crusades? You know how many games of Castles and Crusades I've played in 2023? 3! So I get that you're angry at me because I pander to these other 5e companies. And I get that you're angry at these companies because you think they dropped the ball and continue to support 5e when they shouldn't. And I get that you're angry at Wizards of the Coast because you think the way Wizards of the Coast is handling your beloved Dungeons and Dragons is wrong. You have all told me on more than one occasion how you hate Wizards of the Coast Dungeons and Dragons and how you hate 5e Dungeons and Dragons. And my response has continuously been, 5e is not Dungeons and Dragons. And it is only when you realize that 5e works. So I pander to these third-party companies again because I want them to succeed and I want Wizards of the Coast to fail. So Wizards of the Coast wises up before June 2027 and gives us the Dungeons and Dragons we want. Brings Dungeons and Dragons back to the point where the old school is like, yes, I want to play this because it's the Dungeons and Dragons I love. and the 5e players go, yes, I want to play this because it's a good game and it still lets me do what I want to do. And all the other people in between who are just floating around, jumping on the latest political anger because they have nothing else better to do, will go, hey, here's the version of D&D the way it should be. And it's because of that I'm taking all the attention that I'm giving to these other companies, and I'm going back to Wizards of the Coast or whoever has D&D in 2027, because at the end of the day, we want a Dungeons & Dragons that does what Dungeons & Dragons is supposed to do. We want a Dungeons & Dragons that gives us that experience that those of us who've been playing for the previous 50 years love, that we don't feel Wizards of the Coast is doing anymore. And we also want all the people who are going forward to be able to play a decent version of the game without the nonsense of 5e and the 5e engine, which again is a great engine for any type of play except D&D play. But it's a great engine for, Kobold Press Midgard because they understood it. It's a great engine for Level Up 5e because they understood it. It's a great engine for 5e Iron Kingdoms because Iron Kingdoms understood it. And if I were going to run Spelljammer, then of course I'd use the 5e engine because the 5e engine works with that type of energy and that type of style of play. That over-the-top Saturday morning cartoon style of play is the 5e engine. The 5e engine is not Dungeons & Dragons. And Wizards of the Coast has, I think we can all agree, except for maybe J. Scott Garrity, dropped the ball on Dungeons & Dragons. So that, my friends, again, is why I pander. And if that upsets you, I'm sorry. I'm not going to stop. If it costs me subs, oh well. If it gets me subs, great. Because I think you've all forgotten that I am a hopeless shill who will gladly sell out. So if Daggerheart says, yes, we will give you a shirt, I will say, yes, I will support Daggerheart. Because I'll sell out. I've been honest about that since day one in 2015. I want to make money. Because this is all I'm good at. And I'm not very good at this, right? Anyways, I felt I owed an explanation. So that is why I've wasted 20 minutes of your time. So it upsets you, again, that I cover these 5e people so much and you don't want them to succeed because something Wizards of the Coast. Remember for a second the amount of times you have told me how much you hate the way Wizards of the Coast is treated Dungeons & Dragons and how you wish somebody else was doing the job. Well, in order for that to happen, all that 5e money has to go somewhere else. And that is why we want Kobold Press's Tales for the Valiant and Project Black Flag to succeed. That is why we want Matt Colville's game to succeed. And that's why we want Level Up 5e to succeed. We want that money to go over there so Wizards of the Coast takes their head out of their billion-dollar swimming pool and goes, wait a sec, we're losing money. And if we keep losing money, Hasbro's going to drop the axe on us in 2027. Hasbro has said so. Hasbro has said you have till 2027 to make this amount of money every year or else. And I, for one, want them to fail. I don't want them to meet that mark. I want to continue to see the numbers be in the negatives. So when 2027 rolls around, Hasbro goes, change D&D so we get all those D&D fans back, or we're going to sell D&D to somebody who will. Hopefully you understand that. Anyways, that's it. I'm sorry if I upset anybody. But, there were some things said about me, directly or indirectly, in some of these comments that were vaguely could have been perceived as insulting. And while I don't feel I really need to defend myself, I thought hopefully you would understand if I explained it, why I do what I do the way I do it. And if you still don't understand, well, I'm happy to have the conversation with you offline. You can email me. The DMs are down below. You can contact me on Twitter or whatever. And we can have a conversation about it, but I'm not going to change. Okay. It's not, the format is going to stay the same. I'm going to continue to pander to these companies, and I'm going to continue to point out how Wizards of the Coast is failing, Because again, at the end of the day, I want that money to go away from Wizards of the Coast, so Wizards of the Coast changes the way they are presenting our beloved Dungeons and Dragons. 5e is not D&D. I'm your grumpy guide to all the tabletop role-playing game news, weather, and general and nonsense. If you appreciate this nonsense, let me know. If you think I should shut the fuck up, let me know. If you haven't had a chance to subscribe yet, please subscribe. Help me hit 2,000 subs by the end of the year, and I will talk to you all after lunch. See ya. Get off my land.